Greetings, people. Today is going to be a big, extraordinary day. This is Mr. Riggs, and with his co-host,
DOS all Black Guys TV, Richie in the house once again. Big up to everybody joining us. Big up once again for coming through. We've got more information, more knowledge for the people them. I'm happy to be joined by this brother today. It's been a hot minute since we spoke. We was just catching up. It's been a couple years since me and him spoke personally. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. You know the routine, people. As you come in, hit that like button, share out the video, and get comfy as we get into the groove to talk to this brother about a few different things. So yeah, come in, get your questions ready, type them up. You understand? You know the routine. Riggsy, take it away, introduce our brother, and let's get this started.
Okay. And you know, it's the one and only, and I'm going to make him introduce himself and tell us all about himself, even though he's in our archives and he's put a lot of things through, but you know, now he's got a whole heap of books behind him. Pure brains. So I'm going to allow him to introduce himself and give his status of who he is and what he's about.
Greetings, everyone. Brother Terry, Brother Rich, man. Thank you for having me back. My name is Richard Benson. My students know me as Doc B, Doc Benson, Dr. Benson, Professor Benson. So I'm at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, in the States, and have been in the education department doing my thing in terms of instructing since 2009. And my work is, it's a bit of an amalgamation for a very unique footprint that I wanted to make with respect to my identity. So it includes the work of looking at education history, Black freedom movement history, the work of curriculum and instruction and educational philosophy as it relates to those movements, social players, actors, and individuals who come out of the decade is the 1960s in addition to the 1970s and 80s, so those particular 3 decades. But my work and knowledge with respect to what it is that I teach stretches back to the time of the 24th, 3rd dynasty of Kemet, looking at the work of Ptah-hotep, in addition to the work of the parable of the scribes, all the way through to looking at the work of John Henry Clark, Diop, Walter Rodney, one of my favorites with respect to scholarship. I mean, Chancellor Williams, in addition to that, of Ivan Van Sertima. So I look at the antiquated aspects, the antiquated Akibulan or Africa within the context of the role of education, in addition to political education, and have been able to bring that forward to the present day 20th century, 21st century, 20th, 21st century with respect to my scholarship. Most of my work has centered on the life of Malcolm X, educational philosophy of Malcolm X, in addition to the role of social organizations and how education has played a significant factor or been a significant factor with respect to political objectives and how these developments have been able to form one another and the general populace for the purposes of being effective in a political space. So been at it for a while. I love what I do, and I am in the comfort of my home right now in my office / library and having a good time. And again, man, thank you, brothers, for having me on. It's been a while since we've been able to chop it up.
Yeah. So, you know, in speaking in that, I am, you know, as you work in the school and you've got students, what are you teaching at this precise moment today? I mean, in this pandemic at the moment, because everything's online now.
Right. Well, thanks for the question. It's funny because, Brother Terry, I actually was doing a visiting professorship in California at San Francisco State University. And I was slated to be slated through that appointment for the end, not the end, but I would say for the school year 2019, 2002. Pandemic dropped. Right before it dropped, I ended up coming back to Atlanta for the break. And I was slated to go back and, you know, do some more teaching for the months of the spring semester, February, March, April, May, etc. This thing hit, and everything in terms of my teaching shifted. I was already teaching online, but with respect to me being able to go back in person and actually follow up the online with in-person lectures and workshops, I wasn't able to do. So right now, my home institution at Spelman here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm currently residing and where I'm physically located at this moment, I would be doing a course on advocacy at urban schools, and also another course on educational psychology. And then I would have an option between two other courses: one on the history and philosophy of African and African American education, or looking at the role of Malcolm X in the black student movement. So those are some courses that I would be slated to teach in the fall, this coming fall, in person. So right now I know I'm teaching two, but of course they're going to be online. And actually my institution made an announcement today for a 4-phase implementation plan to bring some students back to campus, while some students are going to be online doing online instruction, both synchronous and asynchronous. So that's what I'm into right now. And so right now, I'm not teaching any courses for my home institution, Spelman. Just got done with teaching a course, wrapping up coursework or whatever, teaching for San Francisco State. But in between, I've been doing a lot of online lectures and a lot of online talks and, panels and things of that nature because, like you and a good brother, Rich, folks are trying to figure out this moment. And for those of us who have the time to be able to analyze it and interrogate this particular moment and, do some type of comparison of what's taking place before us, I'm just here to lend my voice and what it is that I've been able to come up with in terms of making sense of all things.
Yeah. So, in its perspective, right? How can I put it? In forms of your teaching these students, what would you say your true profession is in what you do?
Thank you for that question, because I was just talking about this, Terry, probably maybe 2 hours ago, because I was on instructing another class for a graduate program in Chicago. And I was explaining to the students, I said, I'm in higher education. So essentially, I'm doing college level instruction. I have students who are either undergraduate, graduate, or doctoral level students. And I identify as such in terms of being a professor. But first and foremost, my identity as a professional is as a classroom teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I identify first and foremost, is as a classroom teacher. I feel like if you drop me in any class, I don't care if it's kindergarten all the way up through doctoral students, whatever, like I'm going to be able to excel as a teacher. So that's how I identify.
Okay. So in forms of research, because I just want us to go a little bit into the books that you've developed before we go into this, dig into the title that we have. But
Gotcha.
we want to get some groundwork of your research, and you know what, I want you to kind of explain, because I think a lot of people don't even understand what research is, because they run with this knowledge but not knowing the hard work that's been put behind doing research.
Man, beautiful question, brother. One of my co-hosts for a podcast that I have called the Communiversity Forum, we talk about this religiously, relentlessly, and in a very interrogative form. So, to my people out there who are utilizing various platforms and various portals to be able to gain information, it's the preliminary versions of being able to access and learn more about a particular topic, be it Wikipedia, be it YouTube, be it Google Scholar. I think these are important, but these aren't the baseline with respect to doing like literal research. So for my work, I identify as, with respect to my scholarship, I identify as a historian first and foremost. But but in the general sense, under the umbrella of me identifying as a historian falls under the umbrella of me identifying as a social scientist. So whatever the question is that I'm hoping to answer with respect to my research, I'm using a constellation. I'm using a cornucopia of methodologies in order to be able to answer the question, whatever the research question, whatever the inquiry is. So my work as a historian has looked at a period identified as the Black freedom struggle, roughly 54 to, I even stretch it to about 1988 to some degree. Conservatively, I would go 54 until about 1975. And historically, or for the purpose of the research, being able to engage my scholarship as a historian, I depend upon primary data or primary documents. So birth certificates, census data, a journal, a diary that someone may have left, newspaper articles, pamphlets, papers, those particular documents that are attached to the individual, which would have been probably their personal files and papers, journal articles, etc., that may have been written by the individual in first-person account, ethnographic data, or history interviews. And most times when I'm actually putting together a project, I depend heavily on the archives. So I think probably about maybe 3 years ago, when I was in London town hanging out with you, Terry, we were running around doing some shows. We ended up at Kew Gardens at the National Archives. And in addition to that, we ended up at the Black Cultural Archives. And I think we tried to go to the Padmore Institute, but I think New Beacon was under renovation, so we weren't able to access the Padmore. But we went to just 2 archival locations for the purpose of me having to do data collection for a project that I've been working on with respect to looking at activism in the UK. Short version of the title was called Resistance Under the Crown, Black Education, Protests, and Radicalism and Black Radicalism in the United Kingdom and Britain from 65 to 88. But in order for me to be able to tell that narrative, and in many cases interrupt propaganda, and most importantly, interrupt very partial, or I would consider marginalized narratives that don't necessarily give you the fullness of a particular issue around what took place historically, I have to be able to get into the archives. And in addition to that, if possible, talk to persons who may have been around, involved in organizations, those particular time periods, political movements, maybe involved institutionally as teachers, principals, maybe they were students, but being able to grab those narratives in order to get an aerial view or panoramic view around what took place at a particular moment in order to flush out as close as we can possibly get to the truth around a particular aspect historically. So I depend heavily on archives. So I may do preliminary research using the internet, Google Scholar, but it's just to find out where other sources are. So for example, to the question, I can pick up a book or secondary source, and one of the first things that I'm looking at when I pick up the book, especially if it's written by a historian, I'm going to go directly to the bibliography. And then I'm going to look for all of the books, the secondary sources that they use. And most importantly, I'm going to look at the archives that they went to in order to be able to excavate the information, or I would say identify, retrieve, excavate the information in order to apply it to whatever the study that they were working on in order to formulate that book. Because when I look at the bibliography, I'm probably going to say, well, I need to access these books, and I probably need to go to these archives as well for the project that I'm working on, if there's any overlap. So those are just a few techniques that I've been able to use over time. And to your point, research is a very involved undertaking. The internet is, I think, one portal that we can possibly use, but it is far from being the end-all be-all with respect to doing very critical and significant excavation in order to truly find out about a thing. So that's kind of like my process. So I would say that's a part of my process with respect to being able to do research for my line of work.
Okay. Richie, are you
Yeah,
there?
man. I'm right
Yeah,
here, bro.
yeah. Can you just read out the title, and I want you to give me your opinion on what that title means to you.
So the title of the show today is Movements versus Moments, Targeting Sustaining Agendas for Black Liberation. And again, over recently, especially, just using the Black Lives Matter as a starting point. We're looking at an organizational movement that uses a sentiment that, again, is, to me, sustainable. Black Lives Matter, it makes sense. It connects with us, but then the movement itself, as it's playing now, has a lot of problems in it. And I think this is something we've come across over the ages, where there's been certain concrete sentiments, but as we get more into the movement and as we get into the targeting systems for what we need to liberate, that's where it becomes slightly skewed and off. And obviously, through I know what the brother's talking about, he studies, and the figures in history that he studies, I'm sure he's come across those situations where you've got certain personalities that are very clear on their intent and their agendas for Black liberation, but again, through popular demand, it becomes skewed. It becomes something that then takes a life of its own. So, to me, that's what that says. I know the brother's obviously going to have an opinion. So please, Richard, tell us how you feel on that.
Man, thank you, Brother Rich. Well, for me, I think you brought out a lot of good points in terms of a movement versus a moment, and then we probably even could have put another term in the title, whatever. But I'll just unpack it for the sake of what it is that I'm going to be talking about. But we also could have put in organizations, and I think in many cases people may misconstrue the existence of an organization with that of a current movement. And then also they may also confuse or conflate what a moment will give us versus it being a part of an actual movement. So people are always talking about historically and want to refer back to the civil rights movement, or they may talk broadly if they've been able to engage with some type of scholarship, be it through Randall Robinson, be it through Manning Marable, be it through Cedric Robinson, be it through the recent scholars who do Black Power studies, Peniel Joseph, be it through Jeff Ogbar, be it through Akinyele Umoja, be it through myself, Russell Rickford, Ibram Kendi X. I mean, there are a number of us who write on this subject, and we identified more broadly as the Black freedom struggle. So the struggle within itself is all-encompassing of organizations, is all-encompassing of a number of moments. And I think that because that particular dash or bracketed aspect of dealing with history is pronounced with moments and charismatic individuals, people don't necessarily understand that they're attached to organizations and that those organizations are in part and parcel a part of a greater movement and the sustaining activities that actually define the movement versus a moment, and then the organizations who could be a part of the movement, or they could actually just exist during this particular moment, but not necessarily be involved in the movement. Case in point. So let's take Martin King, Dr. Martin Luther King, who by 26 had earned his PhD at Boston University. Then he takes a job in Montgomery, Alabama. And he takes this job as the lead preacher of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So we're talking about a young man who's originally from Atlanta, Georgia, who's going to take a job in Montgomery, Alabama, who's a new PhD and a Black man at this particular point. And not only is he taking the job as a young person, but he's also walking into the midst of a developed organizational movement that is at its ground, like it's literally at ground zero with respect to the developmental aspects. So he's literally walking into the beginning stages of a movement. And that movement had already been developed and curated through the efforts of grassroots Alabama working individuals who were union. They were domestic workers, in addition to former Pullman porters. So you may have heard the name A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was most noted for developing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And one of his, I would say, more pronounced, or I would say chief leadership that developed out of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters is a gentleman by the name of E.D. Nixon. So E.D. Nixon was based in Montgomery. So this is what would have been considered the older guard leadership that Martin King walks into as a 26-year-old new preacher coming into Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. So as Parks, Rosa Parks, that is, who sits down, like proactively sits down, not by accident or coincidence, when she sits down in protest of not moving to the back of the bus and she's taken into custody by the authorities of Montgomery, Alabama, the first phone call she makes is not to her husband. She actually calls E.D. Nixon, who, having this large constellation of a network that had been developed from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, begins the early stages of organizing for the purposes of a boycott. And out of the boycott, or out of the early stages of development leading into the boycott for the general Black persons or Black folk in and around Montgomery, Alabama, these people developed the Montgomery Improvement Association. Now, what's important is not the organization so much as the commitment to sustainability, because you got to remember, these persons had already been doing organizing work. They were well aware of unions, and many of those persons in Alabama throughout the state. You could check Robin Kelly's work, Hammer and Hoe. This particular book, in addition to looking at the grassroots organizing, these persons were very, sophisticated with respect to their political identity as communists. Not all, but many. Now, in entering to this milieu of political activism, players, organizations, past history, and experiential knowledge, King walks in as this new individual who is identified as being young enough and naive enough, energetic enough, charismatic enough to become the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. So we have the establishment of an organization which allows for organizing, mobilizing, communicating, dissemination of information, and then also ensuring that the general populace of Black folks in and around Montgomery, Alabama, are kept abreast with the goings-on of progress around the organizing activities. So the boycott comes out of, well, the boycott is running concurrent, but has its major thrust out of that particular moment of Rosa Parks, and then it's sustained as a movement through this organization, because the organization provides the planning, they provide the objectives, they provide the agenda. They are literally going to assist with the organizing apparatus. And gentlemen, for 381 days, because this cannot be lost upon, history. But I think people really need to understand this with respect to how it is that you build a movement. But for 381 days, Black folks in Montgomery, Alabama consistently boycotted the economic structure, the transportation network, the transportation apparatus. They boycotted getting on buses and any other aspect of public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama for 381 days. And they literally crippled the economic system with respect to transportation that undergirded the political economy of Montgomery, Alabama, because they stayed off of those buses for 381 days. That is a movement because it's sustained, it's planned. And in addition to the boycott, they had a list of demands that accompanied the action of boycotting. So we have a moment. What's the moment? Park sitting down. In addition to, you could add to the moment, Martin King coming to town with a newly minted PhD from Boston University. Now, what's the organization that develops? The Montgomery Improvement Association, which you already have a number of individuals who are very well versed and with experiential knowledge between unions, organizing, in addition to being able to fundraise, and also the Black church, which is extremely important. And then you have the boycott, which is the momentum or political action activity that's coming out of the organization that's developed with the Montgomery Improvement Association. And you have the sustainability of 381 days with an attached agenda for a variety of points with respect to what it is that they want in terms of demands met. More Black drivers, no abuse of passengers, no threat of violence. We literally want Jim Crow laws with respect to Black codes and transportation separation on these particular buses. We want that eradicated. They have a list of items that they want met in addition to the boycott. And that begins the movement for what it is that we identify currently as the civil rights struggle. So, and that movement starts with a boycott. Then after that, you go to sit-ins, stand-ins. From that, you go to freedom rides. There are a number of activities that sustain the movement. And organizations, in many cases, are at the forefront. And then you have other examples in which the organizations may not be formed, but you have the potential for organizations based upon mass mobilization of individuals, and in many cases, young people, students, college-age students, high school-age students, who are beginning to gather and now converge around a particular issue, and then organizations are beginning to form out of those collective identities that persons are beginning to develop around political issues. So there are a number of things that come out of movements, but we can't conflate a moment with a movement.
No, I hear that. I totally hear that. I mean, let me ask you this quickly. I mean, you touched on the fact that they had to have a list of clear demands and stuff and a direction that they wanted to get. But for me, whenever I look at movements, they're only as good as the people that are listening to them. So you have your people who are doing the moment move, meaning that they are fully committed. They know what they're doing and what they're committing to. And then you have the reactionary sentiment of the crowd now. And I always feel that movements can only be sustainable if the audience, the crowd itself, has a greater understanding of the movement itself. Because if they don't, it's only reactionary. And then on an individual level, once you question those individuals now and you start to say, well, why are you supporting this? Now it becomes lackluster because nobody can truly articulate why they're there and what the direction is. So, speak to that.
Man, all great points, Brother Rich. I say first and foremost, with respect to talking about the audience, you have to bring individuals to a space in which they actually are now developed politically and socially in order to engage properly for the purposes of protest. In short, you cannot feed a baby steak. The growth and the rate of consumption is not going to align with what it is that you're hoping to feed them. Even if it may be healthy, it may not be healthy. But in this particular instance, just as an analogy, me saying you cannot feed a baby steak, you have to get the people ready. And how do you get people ready? So that if we are going to go out and protest and we are going to be physically visible, which is necessary, are we all aware why we're here? And I'm not talking about a slogan. I'm not talking about a placard. I'm not talking about something being written on the ground, not a billboard, not a poster. I'm not talking about somebody with a megaphone. I'm not talking about, a mantra. I'm not talking about T-shirts. I'm not talking about just visibility. All these things are critical and align with this moment in which persons are physically present, the agenda has to accompany the presence, because if the people aren't aware, then the energy can be lost on the moment. So the question is, what was the preparatory engagement, and most importantly, the political education and the curriculum that you developed around social justice issues? Because obviously all things that have been taking place that, you know, the brother George Floyd fell victim to, all those things are preparatory. They existed before, and we can look at the list, whether it's Tamir Rice, whether it's Eric Gardner, whether it's Mike Brown, whether it's Trayvon Martin, whether it's Sandra Bland, I mean, whether it's Amadou Diallo. I mean, that list is extremely long. So it isn't anything new. But what took place prior, or as a preface with respect to political education, in order to get the audience ready so that they're not lost on the moment, or they don't become so disheartened or disenchanted in the event that that particular moment does not yield the type of fruit and outcome that they were expecting. So people need to be taught that first and foremost, if we're having movement discussion, we are not talking about a sprint. We're literally talking about a marathon, and it has to be sustained longitudinally. And if you've been able to get the people ready because you've informed them through meetings and saying that, well, we're going to march on this particular courthouse, we're going to march on this precinct, we're literally going to have a show of numbers of 5,000, 10,000 at this particular rally. But they've already been educated prior to the rally to understand that this is a show of force based on mobilizing power and mobilizing effectiveness. But they've already been in study circles. They've already been in political education meetings. They've already been able to commit to memory the 5 or 10 points of an agenda for direct action items that they want executed through the political education process. They're going to have cadre that are developed, and these cadre are possibly going to be recruiting and mobilizing new potential members of persons who showed up who also have an interest in that moment. But they need to be informed by the cadre and the persons who are doing the political education that their role is essentially not only to bring in new members, but to also politicize them along the way so that they understand that the organization that's leading the movement efforts or leading the moment efforts is a part of a larger movement, and it's going to be sustained through information. Sporadic, I would say sporadic reactionary moments, they're going to happen, you know, whether we plan for them or not. But to literally be able to control and limit the amount of reactionary moments versus planned strategies that are going to be more strategic and engineered, that are led by organizational efforts, because you've been able to prep the audiences, prep the people, prep the communities, prep the teachers, prep the young people, prep those persons who are in and around a space around this is how it is that we plan to mobilize. And whether or not that you're part of the organization, even a teenager on the block can be able to recite or spew out what the 5 demands are that we want. We want an end to this. We want an increase to this. We want involvement with this. We want representation with this. We want accountability with this. And those 5 to 10 things to 20 things, everyone's going to know those things, because when you got everyone's attention with the moment, then they say, well, what do you want? You got my attention. I mean, you tearing up shit. The buildings are burning. We don't want any more of our property or the potential of us being able to earn more money based off of commodification with retail good and sales. You've got our attention. We are stopping now. What do you want? Now, to answer that question, whether it's someone who's rank and file or someone who is director of cadre, an individual who's identified in the upper level leadership of an organization, everyone should be able to automatically recite or be able to provide that information at the drop of a hat, because it should be on their fingertips because they've been prepared through political education. That's how you get the audience ready. So it can't be me responding to. It has to be me in a position, or react to. It has to be me in a position responding to this moment, because we've already been doing the work on the ground. So when we've got their attention, we'll say, we want these 10 things off top. What is it that you're ready to negotiate around? What is it that you don't want to move on? What is it that we're not ready to negotiate around? What is it that we can meet in the middle on? How our interests are going to converge in this particular moment to ensure that we get our needs met? Because we'll let you know right now, this show of 10, 1,000, 2,000 people right now, we can double that within a matter of days in the event that you don't want to adhere to with accountability with respect to the death of this person right here. So these are our demands. But if you have the show of force, but you don't have the well-planned, very articulated, and concise demands that have been literally inculcated within your membership, within the persons who are in that moment, if they don't know it, then it can be lost.
Yeah.
No doubt. No doubt. Go Trutel. Sorry, go Trutel.
Just asking, in court, you know, like how we've seen these movements that are happening, like the Black Lives Matter, comparing that to the marches before it. Let's say, for instance, the marches that alluded to the LA riots. Is there anything different nowadays? And do you feel that these movements in these days are effective?
So, for the sake of the conversation, I think globally, wherever this broadcast is going to go, I don't necessarily believe in the language of a riot. I definitely believe in the language of a rebellion.
Yeah,
so
rebellion.
I would say the LA rebellions versus the rebellions, or what it is that we identify currently as is the mobilizing activity around the globe, whether it's been in Belgium, whether it's been in New Zealand, whether it's been in Europe, London, et cetera, around the country. I think one of the main things people need to understand is that moment, though not led through an organization, you had street organizations who had already put the word out in LA that in the event that the verdict with respect to the King hearings did not go favorably as related to the conviction of those police officers who beat Rodney King, that they were literally going to engage in unrest. In this particular case, I think you have more you have involvement, but you don't have the centralized. When I say centralized, you don't necessarily have a organizational body that's leading all of these iterations of protests that are evolving and developing globally. Black Lives Matter is without question an organization, but in many cases, the persons who are involved within these moments of protests, showing up, rallies, et cetera, they're not necessarily members of the organization. It's being used more so now as a mantra versus that being an organizational platform that's the vanguard of this particular moment. So the organization does exist, but then you also have, as any other organization, you have the development over time, and you have splinter groups, and then you have the new development of organizations who are still attaching themselves to the mantra of Black Lives Matter. But it's not centralized in terms of the I would say the global eruption with respect to persons showing up, whether it's you seeing Black Lives Matter on a t-shirt or you seeing it on a poster or a placard. That's not centralized. That within itself is a development, which is a natural development. It's a development and also the evolution of the moment that we find in 2015 that's now become what it is in 2020 in terms of persons wanting to engage and interrupt police brutality and also all forms of repression dealing with the state to engage social justice. So LA is a very, very interesting point in time. And Brother Terry, LA 92, Rodney King, that particular moment caught on film, in addition to those officers going to court, but there was no justice with respect to the outcome because they were all found not guilty. In LA burning as a result of that, that moment is not in isolation. And I'm always bringing that up because that moment in LA 92 is directly tied to Watts 65. So Watts burned in 65 because of police brutality and the National Guard had to be brought in as well. Watts, a section of LA, which is predominantly black, which is and was predominantly black at that particular time. It may be shifting slightly due to gentrification, but Watts, when the Watts unrest, that particular civil unrest as a rebellion erupted, people have to understand the brutality that had been faced in terms of black bodies literally being subjected to the thrash of police intervention who were sent into all black spaces in LA for the purposes of literal black repression, in addition to state control of those concentrated individuals in those sections of Los Angeles. But the most important thing I think people really need to understand is that the police chief at that time, whose name is Parker, Chief Parker at that particular time, actually would recruit his police officers, his white police officers, from the most racist, some from the most violent, some of the most lynching saturated provinces of the South, Mississippi, parts of Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama. He recruited his police officers from the South to come to Los Angeles to join the police force. So we're talking about a very targeted and intentional development of cadre of police who are violent, who have grown up not only with a physical overtone of what anti-black body violence looks like, in addition to a space politically and also based on law, the exposure of how it is that you repress and literally subject black people to state-sanctioned violence. So this is where his recruitment base of police officers were coming from throughout the 1960s. So that legacy, you place it in Los Angeles, we're looking at literally these officers being the children and grandchildren, and in many cases, the direct recipients and also the direct recruits of white migrants from the South to Los Angeles to work in LA as police officers. So by 92, these persons are a part of that legacy. Those police officers are a part of that legacy, just as well as those black folks who are migrants from Louisiana, in addition to Texas, are part of that legacy. So 92 is not in isolation. It's a part of a larger genealogy around the history of violence in Los Angeles, in addition to the very intentional, proactive measures to recruit white officers from the South. What's taking place now is also a part of that larger legacy, but the major difference is the integration of Black Lives Matter, which as an organization, without question, has been effective, but now you see looser confederations of other developments who are using the Black Lives Matter mantra, but aren't necessarily tied to an organization. But in many of the most cases, you do have new iterations that have developed out of the initial establishment of the Black Lives Matter organization from 2014, 2015. So those are some major differences.
Okay. So I wanted to ask something, like in the coalitions of understanding the organization, the youth, and that movement going into in forms of the uprising or the how can I say, the protest, in forms of when something happens, there is some people that they would able to move on like on a random thing of just jumping on the wagon. And then you have some people where it's kind of structured, where they are kind of waiting for something to actually happen to put the infrastructure on it. In the marches that you've seen over the years, which one would have said to yourself would be more effective?
Great question. I think organizations in whether the organization is decentralized with respect to having not rotating membership, but rotating leadership, quote unquote, and develop cadre. And I'm not even talking about an organization larger than 50 people, but organizations who've been able to literally work around a political education agenda as the forerunner has been most effective, because those persons who may identify as sympathizers and eventually become fellow travelers to eventually becoming members. But even if they don't necessarily venture into the realm of becoming card-carrying members of an organization, they are more aware of how it is that they want to engage, in addition to how it is that they want to disengage as relates to protests, because protest does not always have to erupt into some form of civil unrest. I mean, in many of the most cases, you have persons, as you've been able to see throughout, the internet and Instagram, and persons posting pictures and videos, etc., that in many cases in communities that have been victim to unrest with, in terms of buildings burning, whether they were restaurants, whether they were grocery stores, whether they were small, entrepreneurial stores, etc., that you had outside agitators who've literally been the provocateurs. Now, if you have more persons who've been trained, in addition to have been more politically astute around the moment, they're not necessarily caught up in just the moment. They're not necessarily caught up in the protests. They're actually working around strategy to ensure that you not only have a decrease of any type of, I would say, destruction of property, but you have more of an increase around the message that should be the literal thread of the presence of the people who are there in that moment. So, for example, someone who's coming on randomly because they really want to be involved is one of the most perfect recruitment potential moments that you could capitalize on. So if you have more persons who are visibly a part of an organization who've been working around how to organize, and that person's presence won't be lost just because, when I say lost, they won't be lost on the moment just because you didn't necessarily have someone in place to provide them with literature and say, this is a moment, but the follow-up is going to be the next meeting in which we actually talk about the action agenda items that we're going to integrate into the next march that we have, or we're going to integrate when we demand a meeting with the commanding officer of the police department, or the aldermanic ward, or the state representative, or whoever political figure that is put in place. This was just phase one. But if you don't have an agenda item, or I would say action items, or for an agenda, then now you just have more persons who are showing up, but their presence has not been organized so that we can now talk about the next time that we're going to show up. Because that person who showed up probably has a good maybe 10 or 20 people who feel the same way, who probably just couldn't make it that day. But now we've been able to, do low-level recruitment to say, we'll take this information, and we're so glad that you showed up. Please come out to support this effort. And you know what? Do you have 4 or 5 other people who feel the same way that you feel? Oh, yeah, I got a cousin. I got one of my best buddies, just weren't able to come. Some didn't really know what was going on, but they're really concerned because they had a cousin or they had someone in their family who was a victim of police brutality. So we're just trying to get justice and accountability. Cool. Look, take this information, and for the next time that you come to the meeting, bring them with you, because we're planning a rally that's going to be even larger than this one. And then that's how you start the recruiting efforts. And then when they come to the next meeting, then we begin to talk about how it is that we want to be able to engage, and then also take advantage of the press, take advantage of video, take advantage of the moment, and then ensure that this presence of persons who've shown up, who've now been informed, leads to the next stages of being able to target these 5, 10, 15, 20 particular action agenda items that I was speaking to for. So I know that's a long answer to your question, but I will say first and foremost, I do believe that, no education, no information, no investigation, no sustainable movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go on, Richie.
Well, I've just wanted to double down and really, it's as simple Yeah, I think it's a simple answer, but I would like you to speak on it.
Yes, sir.
Again, some of the most successful movements, like the Rosa Parks, like Marcus Garvey's movement, how closely associated, or how key is it that the community and the family unit is intact and the community is intact for those movements? Like, how much do you believe they are tied together as far as the successful movement, as far as the community goes, and how it's formed and how it looks? Because obviously, going back to those times, I personally believe the Black community was better, in a better form as far as the Black family goes and the Black structure of a family. So how key do you think that is, as forms in forms of a successful movement, or creating or capitalizing on successful moments?
I mean, Brother Rich, I think we're talking about a symbiotic relationship. So we're talking about a relationship that essentially is so closely aligned with respect to its engagement and also its interface and overlay, that it makes organizational activity that much easier, because you're already organized coming out of a space, which is your family, which within itself is, if that within itself is organized and has structure, it makes it that much more seamless with respect to being able to engage once you enter into an organization such as a UNIA, or such as, SNCC, or such as the NAACP or RAM or the OAAU. But what I will say is that in many of the most cases, especially with respect to pathos and, these very interruptive policies and historical, I would say historical moments in which they have been very violent on Black life, we're subjected to forms of family, forms of community, which are the literal residual of being, like, I would say, almost victims of warfare, and coming out of, whether it's like the cocaine 1980s, or coming out of the post-Vietnam era, or coming out of the violence of post-anti-Black violent body body subjection, whether in London, for those who are wind rushers. I mean, those individuals who are able to stand on the other side of that particular moment, who survived and still able to have some semblance of family. I mean, I think that within itself is remarkable. So in many of the most cases, we don't have the type of control over what our family may look like. But in the event that we do, those persons who are politically astute enough and also have the energy to be able to organize and join an organization for the purposes of some type of, political advancement, it makes the process even easier. However, what I also have found is that in many cases, organizations that are viable and also effective within community spaces may also be the catalytic force to not only inform Black folks and other folks within spaces who need to be organized the importance of having a solid family structure. So they may not have known prior to, but now you have the advent of an organization that's literally informing them that nothing can be more powerful politically than the development, the advancement, and then also the sustainability of your literal nuclear family structure. And they say, wow, we never saw ourselves as being, the political embodiment of a force as a family. And we're looking like two parents within a home, being able to take care of children, sustainable incomes, and not even necessarily talking about an opulent amount of money or finances, but just the mere fact that you're intact as a literal unit. That within itself is a political act, in addition to it being the potential of a future force of political engagement in the event that that family so chooses to become a part of a UNIA. So it's extremely important. But I think it's not a situation as to whether or not one has to come before the other. One can definitely come before the other, but one can definitely inform the other in the event that one is not there as a preface. So if the family's not there, the organization can actually be a force to which assists within a general process of communities building family, and understanding the vital importance of family as a political act.
No doubt, bro. No doubt. Listen, just before Rick comes back. Sorry, go on.
Thank you for that question. I like that question.
No doubt. No, well, again, on the channel, we're all about the Black family, and something that me and Riggs talk about a lot, and other people that join us. Again, the keystone to Black nation is the Black family.
Without question.
You know what I'm saying? So again, it's something that we always try to stress over here, because for me, whenever we talk about Black excellence, you know, it's great to talk about pyramids, talk about all the achievements of Black people, but I think sometimes we skate over what the foundation needs to be for that Black excellence to grow out of, and it's the family structure.
Brother, I couldn't agree with you more. And historically, Black folks have known that. I mean, I think what's understudied that probably can't even necessarily be stressed enough is how post antebellum, so during the period of emancipation that will stretch anywhere between, we could say conservatively, from 1865 through kind of like the first 5 years of Reconstruction, so 1865 to 1870, I mean, you still have Black folks, formerly enslaved Africans walking throughout the United States in the South, looking for their husbands, looking for their wives, looking for their children, because they had been sold, they had been literally given away, they had been kidnapped. I mean, you have persons who are looking for their loved ones because intrinsically they understood the value. Just how important family is. So much so that people will walk hundreds of miles checking, you know, former plantation sites, just looking for their loved ones. So family has been something, to your point, that has always been at the forefront of a greater liberation project in terms of African sustainability. So, brother, I couldn't agree with you more.
No, that's it. That's it. And again, as far as having a revolutionary, if you're ever just like wealth, if you want to pass that on, this is where legacy comes into it.
Indeed,
you know, as I always say, I give you £10 million and a £20 million company. Suddenly, it will matter who your son and daughter is, where they're educated, you know, who they're associated with.
Indeed.
You know what I'm saying? All of those factors come in, and I think because we've been robbed of those generational wealth, and we've misconstrued that as Black people, we are the first resource. Before, because we always talk about resources in the ground, and you know, I know you travel back and forth to Africa yourself, so you know what's good. But again, we often skip over the fact that us as Black people are the first resource. So when you're talking about that Black family, that's where it has to be intact, because that is the diamond right there. That is the heart of the whole thing.
Definitely, brother.
Okay, so I wanted to go, Bro Rich. When I was doing my research on the times of the movements back in the day, and I came across in the times of the civil rights, because I've always wondered, how did these things come apart in forms of two organizations? Instead of them to come together, they will cross-wire themselves, and sometimes get one organization over counteracting the other because of their forms of direction. So in forms of, I just wanted to give us a bit of an insight in the facts of civil rights and the women's rights, and how that got diverted.
Well, I think there are a number of factors, and I think that's a great point, because I think that I think history may not necessarily provide the how can I put this? I don't think history. I won't say history. I don't think many historians do a more overt job, more of an overt job to show the complexities with respect to membership and then also involvement. So, for example, you could be involved with SNCC as a literal member or someone who's a field worker, but at the same time, you could also have overlapping relationships with the Congress of Radical Equality, and maybe you also have attended meetings for the Revolutionary Action Movement, or RAM. And maybe when you're North, you're involved with another chapter of maybe the Friends of SNCC in Chicago or Detroit. So you have overlapping memberships, even though you probably spend a concentrated amount of time with SNCC. But you may still involve yourself with meetings, rallies, and other organizations, et cetera, which provides overlapping membership to some degree. And I think in many of the most cases, with respect to looking at a movement, with respect in terms of looking at players, those involved as members, those involved as like literal workers, those involved as supporters, those involved as financiers. Over time, one, basic thing happens just as in human nature. You have an evolution of ideology in addition to objectives and aims. So an organization such as SNCC went through 4 or 5 stages. In addition to going through those stages, the people also go through stages. They marry, they intermarry, within the organization. They literally have paths of divergence. Maybe they leave out of the organization and go into teaching. Maybe they actually go into literally into the political sector themselves. Maybe they become full-time organizers. Maybe that organization actually does not provide the level of fulfillment politically, and those persons find themselves now drifting into other organizations that probably have a more orthodox, or I would say hardline perspective, in addition to ideology in terms of their political nuances. So all of these things, play a significant role. And we begin to talk about, the women's movement, or we begin to talk about maybe critical Black third world feminism. That within itself is a part of and comes out of something like SNCC. Members like Frances Beale, who are part of SNCC, who come up with the Black Women's Manifesto, is very forthright in her writings, in addition to publication and interviews, with speaking to how their role within SNCC in terms of developing what becomes the Black Women's Congress, and then eventually the Third World Women's Liberation Front, comes out of the work that they were doing in SNCC, which was prefaced by women such as Gwendolyn Patton, who had developed her own 2 organizations in addition to an anti-draft organization that accompanies something called the National Association of Black Students. So what I'm saying essentially is the organizations themselves can be the baseline formations out of which you have a constellation or branches of other organizations that develop as the people develop. And as the people begin to develop and evolve out of the initial formation, you can have a number of iterations that find themselves growing out of the initial formation based upon where it is that the people are going, in addition to their newfound aims and objectives. So to your question, the women's movement comes out of that. As many other people will say that many other movements with respect to ethnic studies come out of Black liberation movements. So initiating with SNCC, initiating with RAM, evolving into Black Power, evolving into African liberation and the call for ethnic studies, which is Pan-Africanist, evolving into New Left iterations, which find, themselves looking at students of democratic society, different left formation Marxist groups that were majority Black, becoming offshoots of the Panther Party within the U.S. And as they're evolving, and these persons are literally finding themselves in new spaces with new interests, they all have this genealogical relationship back to the initial org, such as a SNCC. And you find that throughout the movement. There are a number of cases in which you find that. Like, for example, I'm thinking of, we can actually talk about the work of Ella Baker, who many persons are unaware of, but is a Black woman who is trained in political activity and engagement coming out of Harlem. She has her earliest work within the school system within New York City, then also concurrently with the NAACP. and through the NAACP, also the Friends Circle. I'm blocking on the full name or whatever, but it was called the In Friendship. So In Friendship was kind of like a financial apparatus that was an offshoot coming out of the NAACP that found itself conjoined with persons like Bayard Rustin. And that became the undergirding apparatus, but still Ella Baker. We got her school system, NAACP, In Friendship. Then from In Friendship, she works with King with the SCLC. Then from the SCLC, she's also concurrently working prior to the SCLC, pre-King, pre-In Friendship with the Highlander Folk School. So she's evolving. And she's also not only a founding member of SCLC, but then becomes the founder, for the most part, the founding organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now that's about 4 to 5 different organizations, time span of about 30 years, conservatively. And I know I'm missing out, other data within that, but that's just a genealogy. But within that time, we have her evolving as an individual, in addition to her now finding new interests in other areas of protesting in the movement. And with that, you also have new objectives. And that's just one person. So I think that that can't be overstated, just in talking about the people who make up these organizations who now are beginning to veer in different directions, who are at the forefront of developing new ideology, and then also new movements as they're evolving as well.
Okay, so as we were saying, that all these new movements are arising at preferably almost the same time and arising into situation. I was looking at the perspective of that now that we have all these organizations floating. In forms of looking from an outside looking in, and if I had a political agenda, would I able to use them organizations to my advantage, or able to link to create a form of destruction within the community?
Go back again, Brother Terry. You said something about destruction.
Yeah, in forms of not even destruction, because when we look at certain times of history, and we look at what was going on around that time. So let's say, for instance, in that period of time, we have these organizations coming up. We have a pandemic in probably let's say the heroin period, and people are getting frustrated and stressed out. But then, in forms of using let's say the system or the government are able to utilize it. And because what I've realized is that sometimes these things arise, and it's like the government throw a bone, and we pick it up and eat it.
Man, brother, great question. It's actually tying into my current book that I'm hoping to finish up by the end of the year. So that particular project is actually looking at the role of finances, but specifically church money, as relates to organizations who are hoping to get some type of subsidy or being underwritten in order to do community development work. So how can those organizations possibly be co-opted in the event that they're doing community-based work? I mean, brother, there's so many different ways. I think whether we're talking about, a governmental apparatus that's actually providing subsidies, or we're talking about a private philanthropic organization or foundation that's providing subsidies or underwriting, providing resources. I mean, in many of the most ways, you just have to ask a basic question. Is your liberation or your objectives as it relates to your overall liberation project, will it be able to maintain itself, stay intact in the event that you do find outside resources that are so-called donated to you? Will there be an expectation for concessions? Will people expect you to do anything different from what it is that you have been doing in the event that they do give you this money? Because nothing comes without a price. So whether you pay for it in a year or you pay for it in 5 years, do you find yourself being less revolutionary, or do you find yourself conceding to certain political whims in the event that you are provided with financing and you fear not receiving more in the future in the event that you maintain a radical line. And I think history has shown us that on too many occasions, even within the current moment and now, Black Lives Matter has come under a number of visceral critiques with respect to being aligned to certain philanthropic foundations. But they're not the first. History has shown us that with other organizations who have either aligned themselves, with philanthropies, or I would say certain philanthropic foundations, or certain individuals who have had philanthropic interests. So the movement has shown us that with the Taconic Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Fields Foundation, the Stern Foundation, in addition to the federal government interventions. And also I brought up church foundations, whether it's the Episcopal Church, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church, whether it's the Methodist Church or the Episcopalian Church, who've all had interest with respect to providing so-called resources for so-called community intervention and projects for urban renewal. And you find out over time that after the concessions have been made and after certain compromises have been agreed to, that the thrust of the activity that was initiated by the organization may become diluted because of these finances that were provided. So to your point, can finances be weaponized in order to neutralize organizations? Without question. Has it been done over a period of time from, I would say, the Harlem Renaissance up into the contemporary? Without question. And civil unrest has found itself at the precipice of not only being compromised through finances, but also being controlled in the future for political purposes, be it through party or individual, in the event that they literally want to guide the momentum being used, and they can see it being done by providing resources or underwriting an organization. And in many cases, money can be provided for the purposes of just ensuring someone's silence. So that organization could be the mitigating factor between ensuring that buildings won't be burned, even if they probably do need to, even if civil unrest is probably a viable tool, that organization could be the mitigating factor if enough money is given for them to literally control the silence and neutralize unrest so that there is no property destruction, or even so to ensure that there is no protest. So yes, resources can be weaponized in such a factor. And in this case, we would consider it toxic charity.
Mm-hmm. No, and when we were doing we was talking about some form of research at one stage. And we was going through the financial side of things in forms of that even when these organizations got the money, that some of this money kind of disappeared, as they per se. Mm-hmm. In certain circumstances, do you feel that when this money disappears, these organizations disappear at the same time? Or do they still stay around to get what they need?
It depends on the org. And I really think it depends on the organization. It depends on the amount of money that actually has been infused into the organization. It depends on the aims, and it also depends on the usury. So do you have interests that are greater than an organization that has deemed them to be more necessary than just the existence of 1 or 2 years? Or have they been identified as a group or an organization that could necessarily be developed and then also grown out for political purposes to do the bidding of someone that could be an unseen hand? So I really think it depends on the potential of the organization, and then also the growth, and then also the future prospects around how it is that this org or person or persons and org can grow itself out to be literally a controlling factor to ensure the election of a new political figure, or maybe the disruption of an election for another political figure. So I really think it has to do a lot with how it is that those persons who have the power of the purse can foresee the utility of that organization. But to your point, some have been around for, dozens of years, whereas some have a shelf life of only maybe 5 years. I've seen it both ways. Like, for example, and this is not necessarily to isolate the Urban League in any way, shape, or form from any other organization, but the Urban League has been in existence since the turn of the century. And, they on many occasions, especially through the moment of the movement, have been identified as persons who at some point were very advantageous with respect to the reception of finances, but may not necessarily have been at the forefront in terms of leading any protest activity, but were the beneficiaries with respect to receiving finance coming either from the people or from other philanthropic organizations with the hope and promise of being able to engage in some type of social protest. But, and again, it's not to pick on them. I mean, there are many other organizations. I think close to the Big Six or the so-called Big Five, absent that of the Student Nonviolent Coordinator Committee, will probably be one of the best ways to see how an organization can be sustained over time, but not necessarily have the type of media presence or even the political presence, but for some odd reason, they're still in existence. And I think history definitely has shown and teaches us that. So to your question, I think some of the organizations definitely have, a limited time. And I think it really depends on this, whether or not that they were willing to acquiesce to the request of the money wielders. If you do this, we'll give you this. Some persons, may present the cooperation of being able to do one thing, and then once they get the money, they probably maintain their radical stance. And then they understand that they're going to have a limited time of existence because they've chosen not to literally follow the path of those persons who want to control them with the purse power. So it's like, okay, well, look, we only have 3 to 4 years in which we're actually going to be able to execute this agenda. We've gotten the money, but we're not going to do what it is that we've actually promised these persons that we were going to do. We're actually going to do something that's going to be more revolutionary with respect to community development and also political advancement. And we're going to execute these programs, be they GED programs, be they political education programs, be they free food programs. And then after that, we probably have 5 years to do it. If we don't get any more money, we just know that we've been able to meet our goal, which was a 5-year period of being able to integrate these things in terms of community advancement. That happens a lot.
Yeah. So in today's timing, and when I'm overlooking, like even let's just use Black Lives Matter, and for me, I look at it in this perspective of that it's a hashtag and it's not really a for say organization, but understanding their manifesto and direction. Like how we can see it, the government can see it in the forms of infiltrating something to their full agenda. Have they had anything in the past of things like that where they're able to say, okay, this is their agenda. The best way is to fund this agenda into creating a massive narrative for all instead of the actual situation at hand?
Yeah, brother, I think that's happened on a number of occasions. I was actually speaking with a doctoral student yesterday. She's working on her thesis in relation to looking at the role of global mobilizations and organizational activity around the anti-apartheid struggle. But we ventured into a conversation to talk about the role of Black Studies programs in the United States. And I was just explaining to her that there's a deep and intricate history of philanthropy, in addition to the role of soft power. So money can be used as a form of soft power to control. So campus unrest throughout the United States in the latter part of the 1960s were the training and proving grounds in order to, for young activists to literally begin, the process of building takeovers, to developing agendas, to getting the needs met of students, especially on campuses of predominantly white institutions and some HBCUs or historically Black college universities as well, where persons wanted a Black studies program. So you would have this intervention of federal monies, and in many of the most cases, not even federal monies, but Ford Foundation monies and other philanthropies, who are actually in control over these moments in order to ensure that not only did they get their programs, but in the event that you had more unrest, they would give more money. So that was a way of control, in addition to ensuring that the campuses were not taking over, but they got what it is that they asked for, but not necessarily in control of what it is that they asked for. So you may have the show of a program or the show of a department, but it may not necessarily have the same type of wielding administrative academic effectiveness, because the persons that possibly need to be in control of it, who will make the type of systemic change necessary on those college campuses, they may not necessarily be a part of the forward thinking. They may be in control by the philanthropic organizations who've been providing the monies. So can money be weaponized, and has been weaponized as kind of like a form of infiltration, in addition to persons coming into organizations to infiltrate, who may also possibly provide inroads to resources? Oh yeah, brother, that's happened countlessly. And I'll give you a name for someone who was a civilian architect of 2 presidential administrations, in addition to working for the Ford Foundation, and also had a literal tie with his brother to the Central Intelligence Agency. But this name is not new for historians to do this work, but the name of McGeorge Bundy. So he worked for the Kennedy administration and for a brief moment with the administration of the Lyndon Baines LBJ or Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, before transitioning over to the Ford Foundation. But he's at the helm of the development of Black studies programs around the country.
Yeah. Richie. Is he there? Yeah, so
no, I'm here. I am here. Sorry, I was just talking to my son. Just give me 2 questions. Yeah, go on. What was you gonna ask me, Tom?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to see if you had any questions in mind at this precise moment.
Sorry, I was fully listening to used to conversation. I didn't even have a question in mind. Listen, people, just remember to hit that like button. I hope everybody's enjoying the conversation. I did want to ask, actually, now I'm thinking about it, in regards to the modern day ADOS movement, because I was just in the chat talking with a brother. What's your take on that?
On ADOS?
Yeah, on ADOS. In respects to a movement, how much it has, do you think it should have been more vocal in this particular time? Because again, we've talked about Black Lives Matter, but for me, I haven't really heard a lot from ADOS. A brother just informed me that, somebody just won a seat in the 4th district of Kentucky, who's apparently somebody from ADOS. So yeah, what's your take on that as again a modern day movement and its sentiments? Do you think it's coming with something constructive, or do you think it's
no, I don't. I'm not a proponent of ADOS. I'm actually an interrupter of a lot of what it is that they spew in relation to looking at the descendants of, or how they identify descendants, or potential recipients of reparations, in the event that things would be granted with respect to their, I would say, their platform. Myself and my co-host, Dr. Khalila Ali, we've actually done a program specifically on ADOS. But I will say this, in terms of it being more sectarian, or when I say sectarian, developing a splinter with respect to persons who may have an interest in looking at something viable as a role of reparations, understanding how it is that history, in addition to, I would say, the global, I would say genealogy history, but most importantly, the role of global interruption and global displacement has affected not only persons, obviously, within the Western Hemisphere, but anywhere that you find a Black body. and that can't be relegated just to one particular space in terms of looking at how it is that persons should be the recipients of, some type of financial repatriation. So to your question, now I'm not a supporter of, but I do understand how someone could easily be attached to what it is that they're speaking of around, their particular platform. So from my vantage point and from my political engagement and then also historical engagement is looking at how any and everyone who has been affected by the Ma'afa, and I'm speaking, definitely to whether it's through the Portuguese, the Spanish, through the Dutch, through the English, through the British. I'm speaking at how there's been a global interruption to which repatriation and reparations should be obviously paid to, whether you were continental and were a victim of the Berlin Conference, or whether you were in the Western Hemisphere and you fell victim to trade that obviously is going as far south as Brazil, all the way to almost to 1890, how that repatriation should be identified within a global context as it relates to Black internationalism or Pan-Africanism. So that's where I stand on ADOS at that point. And what I'll do, I'll also send you a link to that you may want to share, or maybe just want to take a listen to, that myself, my co-host, in addition to a guest that we had on to talk specifically about ADOS. But pretty much that's why I stand on ADOS.
With you, I mean, I can get it.
Like
a lot more. Can you hear me again?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say it's a modern day movement that is holding on to a moment, and as we described, capitalizing on a moment, but using that to steer a sentiment in, for me, as you're saying, causes a splinter cell effect within what effectively is a globalized effort to stifle Black people. So I don't understand how, I'm listening to politics, they can cut out, maybe his, because I think you've got, what is it, 40 million in North America?
So
people, Black people in, I think you've got 40 odd million Black people in North America.
Yeah, almost 40.
And ADOS only proposes that maybe, I think it will 16 million people are eligible for payment. So that's a whole lot of people just in North America alone, let alone the almost 100 million Black people in South America that they're definitely not looking to deal with in any way, shape, or form either. For me, that in itself is problematic. And it's key elements of
ludicrous, really.
Gone.
Just thinking about it, just with respect to trade. I mean, folks forget in terms of the abolition movement that took place in North America. Once slavers post that particular period were literally still going to the continent, kidnapping folks. They just went south. So you have obviously a higher concentration south from 1865 until about 1890, because for whoever would have gone to the Caribbean and then going north, now is almost it's a reversal with respect to history. Just looking at who now is going directly to what it is that we identify as present day Brazil. So those persons are still coming from the same source. They just, based on time, based in prior to even 1865, these persons are now being brought into this space in which they're not necessarily looking at it with respect to nation state. They're looking at the ownership of province based on the byproduct of imperialism. So what does the Spanish own? What does the Portuguese own? What does the British own? What do they own, based on the papal bull? What do they own based on these particular lines of demarcation that have been drawn? So to relegate, payment to just persons in one section, knowing that our kinship and our kith and kin actually extend much further south and also north, I mean, it's ludicrous.
Well, again, and I do believe that is why they've had certain traction given to their movement in certain ways. Because again, I've got a brother from Philly, a good brother of mine called George Macon, who I do shows with a lot, and him and me did a few shows where obviously we had to show the work of movements like Cobra that came before, when it came to reparations and stuff that is actually on the books through those movements, which modern day people aren't aware of. So they believe that ADOS is kind of doing something new when most of their traction has come from other people's works predating them. But again, to the newer age person, they are kind of new to the reparations struggle. So they believe that, there you go, that's it. They start to believe in the hype of this ADOS movement and seeing things happen. So yeah, just talk us through these books that you're showing, just so people are aware. Because I know
your point, right? To your point, with respect to speaking about what came before, etc., we're talking about the work of William Patterson, who was a card-carrying communist, who was essentially, the forerunner to what it is that Malcolm was attempting to develop before his death in 65, but essentially, calling genocide, before the world, with respect to establishing the UN charge around genocide. So this is the work of Patterson, but this is taking place in the 40s. Patterson was also the lawyer who represented the Scottsboro boys in that particular case. This particular book right here, when I was speaking to, these historical moments around how the enslavement process through imperial forces literally drove after 1888, but prior to, with respect to the involvement of the Portuguese. This piece by Gerald Horn is speaking of not only the South, but the very, very deep South, to your point of South America. So I'm showing those to essentially be able to provide some references and resources to the audience in order for them to see that the Liberation Project can't be sectarian. It can't be relegated to just one corner of the globe in terms of how it is that persons have been affected. We're talking about the role of migration. We're talking about the role of displacement, forced migration. We're talking about the need to literally steal away for the purposes of being able to survive. I mean, and all of these things have to be within the context of how it is that you may have found yourself at one point in Haiti, but then maybe you find yourself in Louisiana, or you find yourself remaining in Haiti, or you find yourself moving from the Caribbean further south based upon a political moment, based on the threat of violence, based on survival. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. You have, this thread of a familial legacy in terms of persons who obviously have had to move to different spaces, and in some cases had to oscillate between, North America in addition to the Caribbean, and then coming back further south, et cetera. So all of these relationships that can't be relegated to just one space geographically, because the interconnectedness of all of these individuals, in addition to the enterprise of the enslavement process, have displaced us in the most cases in provinces where we had no say.
Most definitely. I mean, let me ask you this. As somebody I know who travels and has gone to Africa, and obviously, as you said, studies history, how important, because obviously us in the diaspora, we have many organizations and polarizing figures that we can study here in the diaspora, but how important is it for us here to know about revolutionary movements and people from Africa in relation to what we're going through? Because again, a lot of the time the gripe is that, you know, whatever's happening in Africa is happening in Africa. Again, they're doing their own thing. They've never come back for us. And I feel like, and even with this ADOS movement, I believe this is one of the problems of it, that again, it separates us. It severs that link, that inherent link to our brothers and sisters there on the continent, and effectively stops us from investigating more of the story. So how important, in your viewpoint, is it for Africans to not only have their story told, but for them also, as an American who's gone there and taught and lectured, for them to know vice versa?
But before you go there, Richard, because Rich has got something to do a bit later. This kind of, we're gonna have to kind of wrap it up, and we might have to do a part 2. But finish off your dialogue, and then we'll have to come back to this on another note.
No problem. Thanks for the question, Brother Rich. So real quick, before I have to depart, man, I want to thank you, brothers, for definitely having me on. It's been a pleasure, and I definitely look forward to the part 2. And I'll just say this in terms of answering the question, but then also setting us up for what will, you know, come in terms of the part 2 with respect to Brother Rich's question is simple. I think that there's a maintenance of Africanisms on both sides of the Atlantic with respect to how it is that our identity, in some cases, has been not only overt, but in many of the most cases, is to some degree has been suppressed as relates to like this general global impression around African identity, which finds itself throughout the 4 corners of the planet. So to that point, I'll say that when we find out whatever it is that we think we know about the continent, in many of the most cases, it's fragmented, and it's not even providing an inkling with respect to what it is that's going on physically within spaces on the continent, which is without question intentional. And I think the utility of propaganda as relates to either activity or inactivities of persons thinking that there is some type of contention between someone who's a continental African and someone who is a stateside African or whatever, it actually plays back into what it is that we've been speaking of around sectarianism with such a movement like ADOS. So if you think that your struggle in any way, shape, or form is different from that of someone who's also been affected by imperialism, you're woefully wrong. So for someone here to know Malcolm but not know Cabral, it means that you don't understand the Pan-Africanists or the internationalists or the transnational linkages that have always existed in terms of persons seeking the Black land and seeking the land from which they have literally have been divorced from their language, obviously their culture, obviously their identity. And for that to be divorced, or you being separated or divorced from your port of origin, as relates to having a greater understanding around, or I would say in relation to, you know, this overall force that has been dictatorial in addition to very, you know, systemically impactful around the life of Africans throughout the globe, to not understand those relationships means that you're not going to truly understand the potential of impact that global organizing could have. You're definitely not going to understand the greater impact that those forces have had historically. Because, quite simple, if you're looking at someone in Southern America with respect to the current language that they're speaking, and you hear Portuguese but not understanding the relationship between Portugal and, you know, the greater continental impact and how that is literally fueled an empire, then you won't understand the potential around what it is that may be owed to you with respect to the persons who literally interrupted, your humanity. But in order to make them rich, they've done so, but not understand how it is that that particular repatriation is not just localized, it's globalized. So those are just a few things. And our trade, our displacement was global. Even though we may find ourselves in a particular locale, that means that your repatriation would also be global, in addition to all players, actors, organizations, governmental provinces, religious organizations who also benefit from and took part in your displacement. So that's what sectarianism would divorce us from, versus looking at this from an aerial view and the potentiality of what it would actually look like in the event that you were repatriated.
Richie?
No doubt, no doubt. I much appreciate for answering that question. Much appreciate
no
time today.
It's been fun. It's been fun.
Definitely, it's been a pleasure hearing you speak. I definitely want to have you back on to speak more on the etymology and
we would love to,
and development of certain organizations and certain people. But yeah, I really appreciate you. And remember, family, he's been on before. So by all means, go back into the Black Eyes TV archives. Go look for our brother Richard Benson. See him giving information. But today's show was definitely a good build. So much appreciated again for your time, and we'll try and get you on for that part 2 much quicker.
Let's do it. Let's do it in August.
Cool. And I remember we tried to do the Africa link up with you last time. So
yeah, and I'm so upset about that, because I got some very and they align with what it is that your last question was talking about. I got some very interesting questions from organizations, activists in Cape Town who wanted to know more about Malcolm. So, and a lot of it was me unpacking myth versus speaking to what it is that I felt that they may have already known, but I was sadly mistaken. So I unpacked a lot of myth and then provided a lot of information and resources with respect to the life and also the political legacy of Malcolm. But it aligns directly with your question, brother. But we can talk more about that on part 2 in August.
Most definitely. Well, big up again, brother. Like, much appreciated. Riggsy, take us out. Tell the people what they can expect.
Before we quickly go out, tomorrow, as you know, 9 o'clock, we've got Total Exposure. It's a stage for up and coming new artists to come and perform and do their thing, which we have a DJ, we have presenters presenting it, questions and answers. People can engage within the music industry. It's something good to listen to. On Friday, we have one of the guys from the NOI, Akim, who is the head of the NOI Europe. We'll be doing a 2-day bonanza with that. So, and we have a special surprise on the Saturday. So please tune in, engage, hit that like button, and we'll always be there. Just keep on sharing and liking. And you know what? As I always say, spend black, believe in black, do black, enjoy black, and many other things of blackness that can arise. But if there's one thing that you would like to say, Richard Benson, what would you say to the people?
Go on. I would just say, research the research. Do not take whatever surface level information that you were given as being a rule of thumb. You need to investigate and literally, you need to build a cache of information. So, search the research.
Thank you. Peace, love, and harmony, people.